Now, call me old-fashioned, but the idea of shitting my pants in public fills me with dread. When I was 11 years old, I went through a traumatic experience which changed the course of my life. An absolute arsehole of a teacher refused to let me use the toilet in the middle of a lesson, which led to me wetting myself in front of all of my friends in year 7. After that, a series of phobias appeared, anxieties around being trapped places, anxieties around not being able to find a toilet. My obsession with going to the toilet and feeling like I was empty led to physical challenges as well. And by the time I was 13 or 14, I was diagnosed with IBS, Irritable Bowel Syndrome. Over the next 15-20 years, this fear of not being able to access a toilet was deep-rooted within me. It meant that I made decisions about holidays I went on, excursions I did, activities I took part in, social gatherings I attended, relationships I was in. All of those things were challenged by this concept that I might embarrass myself in public. And it evolved from what was like quite a normal response from my bladder, you need to go to the toilet, and I wasn't allowed to a really irrational, bowel-based fear. It got to the point where it was impacting my life so profoundly that I spoke to a doctor about it, and they referred me to CBT, Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. And in this video, I'm going to talk about my experience and whether or not it changed my life. Welcome back to A Happy Change. My name is Alex. Hopefully you know that already. If you don't, maybe you're one of the 85% of people that watch these videos and don't hit subscribe. If you want weekly videos on well-being and mental health recovery, this is an amazing channel for you. It's great to have you here. So I turned up at this GP surgery and there was a side room arranged. I walked through the door not really knowing what to expect, to be greeted by a gang of 8 people sat in a circle with 2 counsellors off to the side preparing some teas and coffees. I wasn't quite sure whether or not a group therapy was going to be the answer for me, particularly because I felt like I was dealing and talking about something I was really embarrassed about. Yet, as we sat around that circle and everyone introduced themselves, I realised that we were all dealing with our own insecurities, our own phobias and our own challenges. And interestingly, I realised that as I looked around the room and listened to everyone else's fear felt quite irrational. And if I mirrored that back on myself, I realised that when I spoke, the things that were challenging me stemmed from an irrational place as well. So I embarked on a series of 90-minute sessions. They were every single week for about a 6-week period. And during that time, we were introduced to not just CBT, but also starting to focus on our own insecurities as well, and how cognitive behavioural therapy could be used to adjust and reframe some of the challenges that we were having. If you've experienced CBT, just give me a little thumbs up on this video so I can see how many of you out there have experienced it. Every time it came to my turn to talk, I would get really embarrassed because I was talking about my bodily functions. I always found it more difficult to talk about what scared me. But again, that was the same for every person in that room. I might have found it easier to talk about my health in general, but actually going to the toilet or a fear of not being able to go to the toilet felt really embarrassing for me. So I guess that would be like my first thing to bear in mind is if you're going for CBT, is it a group therapy or is it a one-to-one therapy with a therapist? Group therapy can be really beneficial because you're going to learn a lot about other people in that time, but you've just actually got to be really open. There's no point going into that session and pretending that the problem is something else, because actually the way that you'll hone in your toolkit will be based on the real specifics of the problem. And whilst you'll be able to apply those to other things, actually when you're there with an expert, what you want to do is be honest and open about what it is that's really challenging you. So this was the first time really I was introduced to this idea of fight or flight, and the idea that the need to go to the toilet in challenging situations, in stressful situations is like quite normal. It's an instinct. For me, the triggers were like being stuck somewhere. So flashing back to being in that classroom and not being allowed to use the toilet. If ever I was in my adult life stood in a queue in a theme park or stuck on a train that had broken down, that's when my panic would start to erupt. And that's when the physical symptoms of IBS would start to appear. So yeah, I had challenges with certain foods, but I realized what I was doing is lots of the challenges I were facing were actually dictated by my brain rather than my gut. So by growing my understanding of our body's natural response to panic, I felt a little bit more empowered when these things happened, that they were normal, they were things that happen to everyone. And I think that was always part of my anxiety, is like, I'm really different if I need to go to the toilet, whereas lots of people do need to go to the toilet and don't feel embarrassed by it. For me, it was a really big deal, if I was in a meeting or in a lesson, to suddenly kind of go, I need to leave the room at this point. Despite the fact lots of people might be leaving the room over a 2 or 3 hour period in a meeting or a seminar, actually I would feel like everyone was looking at me like, oh, he's gone to the toilet. So the first thing CBT did was allowed me to recognize what was normal and what wasn't. It allowed me to kind of dissect where were the irrational thoughts coming from and where were the rational thoughts coming from. Once I could kind of label those irrational thoughts, it allowed me to unpick that a little bit further. And the big thing that really helped was this idea of exposure therapy. So the counsellors I worked with put us in situations that challenged our phobias. So for me, what they challenged me to do was to walk about, say, 10 minutes down the road to this shop to purchase something and to walk back, which might seem minor, but at the time that would feel like terrifying for me to be told to do that, because I hadn't planned the route. I used to plan every route I had around whether or not there were toilets. I used to download toilet maps for cities when I was visiting, just so I felt equipped and empowered to be able to handle things. So to be told to do that, and then for them to say, and you're not allowed to go to the toilet first, was like terrifying, because one thing would be walking down 10 minutes of streets I'm not familiar with, but the other thing would be I would always go to the toilet before I left somewhere. So to be told I wasn't allowed to, I had to go to the shop and buy something and walk back another 10 minutes, all of that time without having access to a toilet was terrifying for me. But I did it. And over the weeks, we chipped away at this and we built in more opportunities for exposure. So I was set tasks to do at work. So for example, if I was teaching a lesson and then I had a 5-minute break and then another lesson, is not use that 5 minutes to go to the toilet. Because quite often I would go even when I didn't need to, but I would go out of fear to try and build a better routine for my bladder and my bowels by putting myself in situations that I found more challenging. And the other thing with that was what it allowed me to see was my body was able to cope. Like my need to go to the toilet didn't mean I was needing to go right now. It meant my body was saying at some point soon, you're going to need to go. And what that allowed me to do was really think about the process that happens in my head. So I went from the first sign of needing to go to the toilet would mean I have to find a bathroom immediately, to recognizing, at some point in the next couple of hours, I'm probably going to need to go to the toilet. That's a major change for someone that would plan his day around access to toilets. It sounds weird reflecting on it now because it's so far from the person I am now. It feels irrational at this point, but everything in my life was dictated whether or not I could use a bathroom. So over the course of the weeks, I was equipped with all these different tools and genuinely left that room on the final day being a completely different person. There wasn't any really intrusive therapy. There wasn't anything that made me reflect too deeply, but it did allow me to have a set of tools in place to calm myself down when I start to panic and to recognize the normal body functions versus the abnormal body functions and silo them into the correct position. Is this urgent or is this just my body giving me a little heads up? I would say without that, I would still be in a position now where my life would be dictated by toilet stops, which is why when people talk about their anxieties and their phobias, I always say, have you tried CBT or have you tried talking therapy? Because for me, I went from someone who was fairly cynical about that process to someone who has genuinely had their life changed by that process. It'd be great to get some feedback. Did you try CBT for your IBS or for your phobias? How did it work out for you?